Welcome back to another episode of Sound and Pals Go to the Movies. This is another throwback episode. I'm here with my friend Touly. Say hi, Touly.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're going to review Dracula from 1931, the Bela Lugosi version. And just a fair warning, there's going to be spoilers up ahead, so you've been warned. The ancient vampire Count Dracula arrives in England and begins to prey upon the virtuous young Mina. So, Touly, I believe that this is your first time watching this movie. So why don't you start off and tell us your review?
Needless to say, I don't tend to watch these sort of movies because they're among classics. I mean, I could at least give them credit where credit due, and this film is easily among those revolutionary movies back in the days that altered the course of history in terms of, even if you were to consider the horror genre was being influenced by this film. I mean, it's going to be a little difficult for me to review this movie because I don't want to compare it to modern time films because, again, this was back in the day when there was so much lacking in terms of like technology or even how actors or actresses were portraying characters, and it was just a different vibe and stuff like that, which is understandably so because this was just like the beginning of so many things in the movie industry. So I'm trying to look at this from its own content and not compare it too much, and because of that, all I can really say is this film was extremely revolutionary. Dracula being played here by Bela Lugosi, I mean, you can't really say much more than him playing such an iconic character that has transcended time and has influenced so many other movies or TV shows. His figure has been used in so many like pop culture references. I can see why, after watching this film, the way they shot his introduction, like whenever he was at a different scene or when he was about to attack one of his victims and stuff, like the way they showed his face and stuff. I can imagine this being quite a fearful sight back in the day. Like to today's standard, it's not that big of a deal, but back then, I can imagine that sort of shot probably gave people the frights. I mean, I guess this also is attributed to the cinematography and the lighting as well. I mean, it's not as extensive as to modern time, but back then it was different. And I think this is one thing that the film captured that I think maybe perhaps people would speak to, is that the atmosphere that this film brought, it was one of dread until you met, like Van Helsing and how he was trying to take down Dracula, or even try to solve the mystery of why people like dying around the vicinity and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I felt engaged. I wanted to know what would happen to Dracula, even though I already knew what was going to happen in a sense, but I still wanted to see, Dracula's intention, and it played through. Like, I didn't see much like contradictory to his character. He stayed true to what I expected, or how I came to know Dracula as, and then his victims as well. Like they acted true to how I believe victims of people getting bit by a vampire should act like. So I mean, it was believable. Did I enjoy it? Yes. There's not much I could say negatively about it because, like I said, it's really hard for me to compare this to something else because I don't normally watch these sort of films. But as a standalone movie, just to review it as a movie by itself, I think it was great.
I agree with you. Let me go back and establish the content of this movie. This movie was actually made in 1931, and it was based off another movie, Nosferatu, and then we heard that name in the movie at the beginning when the villagers are like, Nosferatu. That's a movie that came out in 1922. The same thing. It's about Dracula, but the name is different. The same thing. We know Dracula as Count Dracula. We know him in different names. Nosferatu is the original character in a different language. They made this movie originally as a play. Bela Lugosi got to portray him in plays. Then Universal picked it up and said, we're going to make a movie. Back in the day, it was monster movies coming out left and right from Universal Studios, and this is one of the famous Universal monster films. When they made this movie back in the day, there was no subtitles. So what studios would do was film the movie again in the same way, with the same set and different actors. So for example, if you wanted to make an English version, you would cast the English actors, and if you wanted to make a French one, you would cast French people, and if you wanted to make a Spanish movie, you would cast people who spoke Spanish. In that sense, there's two versions of this movie that exist, the English and the Spanish. Same sets, but different director and different cast members. Some people say that the Spanish version takes liberties with the camera, more different angles, more cuts, more edits, in a sense, better format of the film versus the acting. In the Spanish one, the acting is not as up to par as this movie. It's a little cheesy, but other actors deliver better lines. The English version, as I see it, lacks in the camera angles, the cuts and edits. There's a bunch of jumps in time that we see. We see Dracula in England. Well, before he comes to England, he's in Transylvania. Then he jumps to the boat. Then we jump from the boat to England. There's a lack of story-driven, how can I say this? Story is not really connected. There's gaps and things that are missing in between. So the reason for this is that the studio had not a lot of money, so they were limited to shoots. They didn't know what they shot. They shot it out of order. And sometimes when you come back and you put it together, you find out that you're missing some parts. And it doesn't make sense, but back in the day, it was just rush it out, edit it, print it, and put it in the movie theater. So now let's go into my review. The cons with this movie is there's not really a lot of good acting in this movie. Some characters really take it above and beyond. They chew the scenery, which is expected for this time. This is 1931. These actors are known to be exaggerated in their characters, to exaggerate to the audience the emotion, because these are people who would come from theater to come to film. Yes, it's fast paced in some parts, and some parts is really slow. There's scenes that take too long for me. The other thing is some of the special effects. Yes, it's 1931. They're cheesy and everything, but when we see the boat scene, it's rocking back and forth. We go back to the actor who's next to the actual box with Bela Lugosi inside of it, Dracula. And he's telling Master, we're almost there. And they're not rocking. The camera's just steady. And I'm like, this is kind of continuity. Like if the boat is shaking, the camera should be shaking in the next scene, That's just my little critique about it. Maybe the director didn't think about this, or, he's just forgot about it. Now let's go to my pros. I really like the use of the lighting, the black and white. It's a good balance. And here's the whole thing. In movies with Dracula portrays the darkness. And then, the other character, which Mina, she portrays the light. So it's a basically, if you want to talk about it, it's a fight between the light and dark. We see the character Van Helsing. He comes in and he's the vampire hunter, if you want to talk about it that way. He's the person who tries to hunt creatures that are mythological creatures, or in this sense, creatures that science does not believe in. So he has evidence, and then he brings them out into the light. So this is a struggle between three forces: the good, the bad, and we have Van Helsing, who tries to take the veil off the scientific community. The next thing that I'm going to rave about is Dracula. The guy who portrayed Dracula was Bela Lugosi. This actor is the guy who basically established what Dracula means to us, or at least to me. Every time I see him in pop culture, it's a derivative from this character, from this act. Every time you hear the lines, "Good evening," this is Bela Lugosi's line. This is Bela Lugosi. Everything that he did with his hands and everything, it's Dracula. Everybody knows Dracula because of this actor. If you see the movie, you actually see that he uses his hands to bring his subjects into his power. He controls them, mind controls them, not as the Dracula or vampires that we know nowadays that suck blood and they turn them into vampires. He's going to give them power to become vampires later. He actually seduced Mina, controlled her mind to do his bidding. We do see him transform from human to bats. We also heard that he has the ability to turn from a human to bat and also to a wolf. The same way Van Helsing allures that he can kill the creature with a stake to drive it through his heart. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is that I really wanted to see that scene where he gets a stake driven through his heart, the same way I'm going to talk about in Nosferatu. We do see in Nosferatu Dracula getting stabbed through, the heart with a stake. And that's basically a big historical part of that movie. You do see a fadeaway scene of Nosferatu kind of disappearing. In this one, we just saw him and the camera shifted, and we just take it as for granted that he got a stake driven through his heart, and then we see Mina snapping out of mind control. The other thing is that there is no soundtrack to this film. The reason is Universal did not have rights to any soundtrack, or did not want to waste more money creating its own soundtrack. The other thing they got away with, at the opening, when the movie starts, we only hear the music from Swan Lake, in particular Act 2. That's the music that plays every time we see Dracula or we think about Dracula in this movie. I think that's my only critiques about this movie, other than I want to rave about Bela Lugosi's acting. Anything else you want to add, Touly?
No, I think you hit it on the point. I mean, I did notice the scenery shift between, Dracula from Transylvania to, going onto the ship and, traveling elsewhere. Yeah, there was a gap there. But again, not being too familiar with these sort of classical films, I wasn't too certain as to the reason behind it, like whether that was like intentional back then or was it due to budgeting, like you pointed out. Yeah, I mean, the movie, it had its flaws, and I'm glad you pointed it out, because then I wouldn't know how to discern them based off of my expectations of these sort of films back in the day. But yeah, like I said earlier, overall, I still enjoyed it. It was a good watch.
Okay, so just a quick question before we give our final grade. Would you recommend this to people who haven't seen this movie or this movies from this time period?
I would, for two reasons. Like you said there, if you're not familiar with these sort of classical films, just to give it, a shot so that you get a sense of where the movie industry, where it was at certain points of history, and to see how far the entertainment world, or I guess, creating movies, how far it has evolved, I guess, for the lack of term. So in a way, it makes you appreciate certain aspects of today's film that maybe you would not had if, you didn't see these classic films. It's the things that they were lacking back then that a lot of movies now take advantage of. So that's one point. The other point is, like you said, the role that Bela Lugosi played here as Dracula. It just gives you a sense of like a pop culture reference, or like where this came from. Like these, if you ever heard those famous lines, or even not line for line, but just the idea behind it, just knowing where it came from, so you kind of can reference back to where it started. Yeah, like you pointed out earlier, this was the first time me seeing this. It's not like I didn't have an awareness of where those famous lines or pop culture references were coming from, but yeah, this was the first time I saw this movie from start to finish, and then being able to tie it to a lot of like Dracula references in today's time. So it just makes me appreciate how far the movie industry has come, and just understanding more so of where these references they derived from as well. So now I could actually, instead of saying, from I saw this from The Simpsons, this was a reference from The Simpsons, now I can say, no, it's a reference that The Simpsons used that was based off of Bela Lugosi's character in Dracula, the movie that came out in 1931. So it gives me a little more credibility in knowing some knowledge. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad you actually enjoyed this movie. I mean, I see this why a lot of film classes actually have this in the curriculum. They tell the students, like, watch Nosferatu, then watch Dracula, and then so they get a better understanding of how film, like you said, has evolved over time. So I'm glad you saw it that way. With that said, we're going to give it a final grade. So Touly, why don't you start off and give us your grade?
My grade is kind of arbitrary because, like I said, I don't have a lot of reference to base this against. But to be on the safe side, just because I enjoy it, movies that I tend to enjoy, and if I would recommend it to other films, they would normally fall between like that 7 to 8 range. So I'm just going to play it safe and give it like around that score, like maybe like a 7.5 to an 8 out of 10.
Well, I agree with you, and I'm going to give it a solid 7.5 out of 10. The only reason I didn't give it an 8 is because I haven't seen the Spanish version, and I really want to see the Spanish version before I kind of give it a little higher, and I'm holding judgment. So, yeah, my grade is going to be a 7.5 out of 10. That wraps up this review for Dracula from 1931, Bela Lugosi version. If you'd like to find more information about the famous actor who portrayed Dracula, Bela Lugosi, in 1931, there are links listed above. The website, belalugosi.com, Facebook, at Bela Lugosi Official, Instagram, at Real Bela Lugosi. Join us next time when we review Memento. Social media is down in the description, and hit us up if you have any questions. And remember, keep watching movies.